Hello, and welcome to our weekly environmental news program. I'm Dale Willman. I run the Resilience Media Project at the Columbia Climate School. This program is being produced in cooperation with the Society of Environmental Journalists. SCJ sends out a daily email roundup of environmental news, and it's free to subscribe, so look for it at scj.org. It's worth the read. There's no real debate in the science community over whether climate change is real. It is. Excuse me. And in a recent study, more than 99% of scientific papers agree on the human causes of climate change. But when it comes to the general public, it's not all that clear. An Ipsos poll in April found that 57% of Americans believe that climate change is mostly caused by human activity. However, some 27% say it's mostly caused by natural patterns, and 6% say it's not even real, which is kind of hard to believe at this point. And the political gap, of course, is huge. Almost half of Republicans believe climate change is caused by natural patterns, compared to 12% of Democrats. So what accounts for this disparity between a scientific certainty and public confusion? We're going to talk about that with Michael Thomas. Michael runs the Substack blog called Distilled, where he talks about climate. It can be found at distilled.earth. Michael has recently been talking about climate disinformation on his blog, and I want to talk with him about that. But first, a reminder that this is your program, so stay with us. In the last 20 minutes, we'll be discussing how you can localize the information we're going to talk about in your daily news coverage. If you have a question, put it in the comments on the platform that you're using to watch us. We should be able to see those questions, and we can have Michael respond. So, Michael, welcome. Really excited to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Dale. I'm excited to be here.
So, tell me a little bit about your background and how you got to this place where you're now reporting on climate issues.
Sure. So I've been producing content on the internet for about 10 years of my career. I have mostly focused on climate over the last 5 years. And before starting Distilled, my Substack newsletter, I started a company called Carbon Switch. And the idea of Carbon Switch was to produce something like a Wirecutter or Consumer Reports for climate with a specific focus on electrification. So what I realized as I was looking at some of the content on the internet, and as I was trying to decarbonize my life, I would go and Google different things like what are the biggest causes of emissions and what's causing my carbon footprint. And I found misleading information on that. And in some cases, just outright disinformation by fossil fuel companies. And so I wanted to create a resource and a series of guides for people that wanted to decarbonize their life and cut their carbon footprint. So I started that in 2020 and produced about 75 guides on everything from heat pumps to solar to induction stoves, and tried to just distill all the information that was out there on these climate solutions for people. So some of those reports and guides that I produced were covered in outlets like CNN, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and were spread pretty widely on social media. So far, they've been read by, I think, 500,000 people or so. But I spent a lot of time before starting Carbon Switch doing journalism and reporting. And while I enjoyed focusing on the solutions and writing these guides, I was really itching to get back to reporting and telling stories. So a couple months ago, I started Distilled, a newsletter that focuses on climate, and have been writing a series of stories about climate disinformation and the fossil fuel industry's efforts to delay climate action, or in a lot of cases, just deny climate change outright.
Sorry, I was trying to bring up your page here, so we can take a look at that as well. So that's your journey getting here, and what I want to focus on a little bit is a particular path that you took recently, and that is In Search of Draws. Can you explain who that is and how you got there?
Yeah, absolutely. So a man named John Draws is not somebody that you're going to hear about much. You won't read about him in the New York Times, or you won't see a 60 Minutes segment on him. Whenever he has been interviewed in the media, he said, this story isn't about me, and really tries to deflect any attention on him. But he is somebody who I believe is one of the more influential figures in climate delay. So John Draws from North Carolina, and he was a real estate investor for most of his career, about 30 years. In 2011, he decided to make a career pivot and positioned himself to legislators and to the media as a climate expert. So he went out and pitched legislators and the media on some of this research that he had done on sea level rise. This was at a time when the legislature locally was debating whether to invest in mitigation and adaptation for climate change. And so John Draws produced this independent research, 112-page presentation, got an audience with the legislature in North Carolina. You can see that there on our video. It's titled "Our Sea Level Policy: From Science or Lobbyists?" And he was actually really effective at getting the ear of not only legislators, mostly Republicans, but the media as well. So the Washington Post quotes him. You've got that up right there, and says, John Draws, a local physicist who was quickly recruited by county officials to undertake an independent review of the 39-inch forecast. That's, of course, referencing sea level rise. So John Draws produced this research, basically said that this wasn't going to happen, and that the state shouldn't be investing in adaptation, and was actually successful at lobbying for this. So he got the state to not act on preparing for climate change and sea level rise. So 2012, he starts to shift his focus and becomes really concerned with this investment across the country in wind energy, which a decade ago was a little bit higher price than fossil fuels, has since fallen. But at the time, very promising technology. Most climate scientists, most technologists would agree that prices were plummeting. This could reduce pollution. This could eventually cut energy costs and was a reliable source of energy. Draws uses his same playbook, does 100 and some page presentation, positions himself as an expert, and goes and presents this to lawmakers and media across the country. And he was successful at convincing local county officials across the country to pass wind ordinance bans, mostly based on false claims around property value decreases, on health impacts of wind energy, which no reputable scientists would say that there are any health impacts. And so he was picked up by this think tank based in DC, American Tradition Institute, which has since been rebranded as the Energy and Environment Legal Institute. This group has received money from fossil fuel companies and executives, and is famous for climate denial. So Draws gets recruited as a senior fellow and produces this 10-page memo that lays out a national strategy to try to block wind energy in the country. And if you look at this playbook, in hindsight, he sort of laid out what these anti-wind activists would use over the next decade. And it's just been incredibly effective. Everything from crazy claims saying that wind energy isn't renewable, it's not sustainable, to lies like wind energy drops property values by 25, 30%. So he lays out this strategy, recruits 20 or 30 residents and NIMBYs and fossil fuel companies, and they all meet in Washington and talk about this strategy. As I mentioned, over the next 10 years, people across the country use this playbook to position wind energy as bad for the environment, bad for local communities, way too expensive, overly subsidized by the government. And that's resulted in a lot of delay and slowdown. I can get into how it's used today based on some reporting I did on Facebook and misinformation, but
let's get to that in a second. But let's so this would not be a huge deal if this was only happening in one or two communities. But would you say he's one of the prominent voices right now making these messages?
He's certainly a very prominent voice. I found out that his email newsletter is read by tens of thousands of people across the country. Some documents released a few years ago found Droz's name mentioned in emails with the Trump administration. So he's able to get the ear of senior EPA officials. There was an effort at one point by Droz and some of his associates to try to get Trump to use his megaphone when he was president to denounce wind energy. And as some people may know, Trump, of course, is a big anti-wind advocate, spreads a lot of misinformation about it. So Droz may or may not have played a part in some of that. And he's trained thousands of people across the country to be, quote, anti-wind activists and use his playbook. So his website has hundreds of pages, documents laying out how to block wind turbines in your country and wind farms, and basically has educated all of these people on effective strategies and what they can do to scare their local officials and ultimately pass local policies that in many cases outright ban clean energy from a community.
Now, Eric Conway and Naomi Oreskes in their book Merchants of Doubt talked about this to some extent, and the long history of this, starting with tobacco industry and these playbooks they've developed to sow doubt within the public about these significant issues leading up to climate change. Do you see any sort of historic connections with him, with some of these other people? Is there sort of a broader thing happening with him, or is this his own sort of?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've recently been going back through Merchants of Doubt, which is just an incredible book. I highly recommend it for anybody that hasn't read it. It really shows that this strategy goes back to the 1950s and 60s. I think that there's some connection between the Merchants of Doubt playbook and Droz and some of the other folks that I've been reporting on, in that the platform that these people use and build is really laid by think tanks with sort of obscure scientific sounding names. So American Tradition Institute, or another one I've been looking at a lot is Caesar Rodney Institute, Thomas Jefferson Institute. You read these names in a paper or something, you think, okay, that's probably a legitimate seeming organization, and they produced a study, and that study showed that climate action is going to cost way too much, or clean energy isn't actually good for the environment. And what a lot of the public doesn't know, and even a lot of journalists don't know when they cover these people, is that the funding for these think tanks is coming from fossil fuel companies or executives. So I recently interviewed a group of researchers at Brown University who have been studying climate obstruction, and they looked at the biggest producers of climate misinformation and the biggest funders of climate misinformation. They looked at who was giving to organizations like Heritage Foundation or Heartland Institute, these groups that have produced research over the last decades, basically discrediting climate scientists, sometimes attacking them, in the case of American Tradition Institute and Heartland Institute, and calling for less regulation. And what these researchers at Brown University found was that 75% of the money that is going to these groups is completely dark, not even going through 501c4s that don't have to disclose their donors, but just we don't even know what organizations or individuals are funding them because they are required to be disclosed by the IRS. And so this could be fossil fuel companies like Exxon, which has a history of funding these groups, or it could be the executives of those companies or wealthy individuals or foundations. But yeah, the playbook, I think, is the same as the Merchants of Doubt playbook, which is fund a think tank using fossil fuel money in a lot of cases. That think tank then produces misleading research that's seen as a source, and then that gets disseminated through media, sometimes mainstream media, even kind of left-leaning. In a lot of cases, though, Fox News and right-leaning media that then convinces a lot of the public that climate change isn't real, the solutions just aren't there yet, which of course isn't true.
This is something I've been fascinated about for a long time. George Lakoff, the linguist from Berkeley, has talked about conservative activists and how conservative and progressive approaches. And progressives think that money needs to go to help people and infrastructure is a bad thing because it takes money away from helping people. But, and this is Lakoff's belief about this, but that the conservatives since the 70s are very good about building infrastructure as a megaphone to amplify their message. So they've spent a lot of money over the years, the last 40, 50 years, building think tanks, building programs like Rush Limbaugh, helping Fox News with amplifying their messages. What I hear you saying is that, again, this infrastructure of think tanks and people like John Draws being funded with this dark money to muddy the waters, to get information out. The mission often isn't to say this is the truth. It's to say there's too much uncertainty about that as being truth, to sow this doubt, right? That's the main game plan here.
Totally. Yeah. I think that's a really important point, that the groundwork for all of this was laid as far back as the 70s. In some cases, as Merchants of Doubt describes, this was a playbook that was used by Big Tobacco to try to prevent regulation in that industry. It was used even in preventing any ozone regulation when CFCs were burning a hole in the ozone. And these think tanks and this infrastructure is now being used today. In some cases, still this climate denial playbook that a lot of us are familiar with. But I think one of the biggest takeaways for me in this reporting has been that the strategy of climate denial has shifted a little bit. And you now see fewer of these think tanks outright denying climate change. I think that's really hard to do today when we have wildfires, heat waves, hurricanes, unlike we've seen in modern history. And so that's just not really resonating with the public as much. But what you see is instead a strategy of delay and a strategy of attacking the solutions like wind and solar. So a lot of the organizations that were funded by these fossil fuel interests and continue to be funded by them are now producing a lot of research attacking wind and solar power and saying things like they're not reliable, when that claim has no grounding in facts. They're definitely reliable. They need firm resources as a backup, which I think a lot of people are working on developing, but we can build a lot more wind and solar right now based on today's grid. And our grid can handle wind and solar with that backup all the way up to, I think 80% was a recent study out of Berkeley. And so they're attacking on that front. Then they're also just spreading outright lies about this stuff. So a really common thing I saw in some of the Facebook groups that I was looking at was people claiming that wind turbines have negative impacts on people's health. So they make people nauseous, they give people headaches. Trump, of course, famously said that wind turbines cause cancer in a speech to, I think, the RNC. That, of course, is not true. But you can see where if you've never heard of this stuff and someone tells you that wind farm that's going to have 100 turbines going up in our community is going to give your kid cancer. That's scary. That's going to get you worried about the project. People will be posting pictures of wind turbines on fire. Incredibly rare incident, but if the only thing you're seeing in Facebook groups or in the news outlets that you're seeing is that wind turbines are dangerous, it makes sense that you would not want them in your community. So I think that's an important part of the strategy that is often overlooked, is that it's not just about climate denial right now. It's about attacking perfectly good solutions and energy sources that could actually save us money, produce great jobs, and improve the environment.
There's maybe 100 dryer fires in houses a year, and yet we don't stop using dryers in our homes, and those fires usually started from lint catching or some other thing. And there are fewer windmills, turbines catching fire as well. And I think this is a point that's important to stress, and was what you're talking about. And what I was going to ask about is this shift, because as we heard from the figures from Ipsos earlier, a majority of Americans do understand the human causes involved in climate change. I don't say believe, because it's not a belief system. This is a fact-based system. So you have to move on past that. And it seems like the playbook has shifted to attacking very specific, the things you were talking about earlier, wind power. These are the problems with wind power. So it's a shift from this complete denial, which they're losing finally, to the specific technologies that are being used. Rare earth. Well, of course, this is going to cause huge amounts of problems with the need for rare earth minerals, which is actually a reasonable conversation to have, but not in the way that they're framing it. So this is a particularly. I think to me it's something that journalists, in particular, who are reporting on these issues, need to understand, because of how these things affect their local community. But so I want to get back to Draws for a second. Physicist?
So he has positioned himself as a physicist.
Right.
Is
And
quoted
the Washington Post quoted him as one, yeah.
Yep. And he doesn't have a physics background, and probably isn't qualified to be producing reports on sea level rise. Certainly not as a primary source, but yeah, has been very effective at getting that message out there.
Does he have any science background at all?
Not from what I understand, no.
But so how does this happen that the Washington Post would quote him as a local physicist?
Well, it's funny. I in reporting on the story about John Draws, I was thinking about how, in some ways, John Draws and I are not that different. We are two people who don't have fancy credentials. I didn't go to Harvard. I'm not a climate scientist at NOAA, and yet I've produced this research and these reports for Carbon Switch, and most recently my newsletter. And I think that it's fairly easy on the internet, and especially in today's media age, to sort of create authority when it might not be justified. So I've been sharing all this stuff on Twitter, and I'm very grateful that people are sharing some of that, are reading it. But I think that a lot of times we don't look as much at the research that NOAA is producing, or that a climate scientist at Berkeley is producing. I think a lot of times it's maybe too dry. And so for someone like Draws, he can put together a good presentation, and those legislators are going to listen to him, or he can pitch media, just like I'll pitch a report of mine from Carbon Switch, and it can get picked up in Bloomberg or in the Wall Street Journal. So of
Sure.
course,
Has Bloomberg and Wall Street Journal referred to you as Michael Thomas physicist?
No, and so that's
the point,
probably where I think it's different. Obviously, I also will, of course, defend myself, saying that am not advocating for burning more fossil fuels, polluting the planet. I'm advocating for climate solutions.
Well, but it's a fact-based advocacy. There's a distinction here. And
totally.
the point I wanted to make here is that, and I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole because there's so much to discuss here as well, but I found in some newsrooms where I've worked over the years that the vetting of sources is much more robust if it's a person of color. They're really cautious to make sure, but when it's a white guy in a tie, we tend to be more accepting of what they tell us about their background and about their credentials. So I'm sure the reporter working for the Washington Post just didn't say to himself, this guy must be a physicist. At some point, draws past himself often that way, but it was just accepted as, well, this must be so. But we have a huge responsibility as journalists to make sure that we vet our sources, understand who they are and what their viewpoint is and where they're coming from. And if someone, it's just this common sense that if someone says they're a physicist, you say, okay, where did you go to school? What's your degree in? Where did this come from? Before you quote them as a reliable source on such an important topic in a national outlet like the Washington Post.
Totally. I think that's such an important point. I think that a lot of times the white guy that shows up and says I'm from some official background gets the pass, and people of color don't, women don't. And that's an injustice that harms those people, but is also just a disservice to readers.
And of course, the number of people of color who are used as sources is still fairly low. I will say I newscast at NPR as well, and I'm very proud of the changes they made and the work that they do to vet their sources and make sure that they are who they are, and to bring in more people of color and more women into that access. But not all news organizations do that, and as shown by this article's Washington Post, and that just, it fascinates me that would get through the editorial process.
I'd love to jump in here.
Please,
okay.
and thank you for handling all the things on the screen, because I just can't seem to have the capacity to do both. So I appreciate you putting up all the graphics.
It's just great, Michael, that you're able to join us. This is Andy Revkin. And, looking at this, there's several things here that are really important to look at. One, here's that story. It was a 2014 Washington Post story. It looks like it was a regional reporter, not a climate reporter. And this was in 2014, before the Washington Post added like 30 people to its desk to cover climate. So I'm not calling out Lori Montgomery particularly, but if you're a sort of a regional reporter and you're at it looks like it was sort of at a town council meeting or Carteret County, whatever. And that's where this can happen. What I'd love to do here is flip this around a little bit and ask you, thinking what you've learned about his methodology, and this more particularly the methodology of these organizations that have funded people like John Draws. Now is the time for those who want to sort of push the case for expanded renewable energy and resilience action at the community level to be doing exactly what he's been doing for the last whatever number of years. It's a distributed model. It's a model that's informing people at the level of the town and county. In this case, not productively, but what have you learned about his methods and those funding him that can be applied in the flip way? We now have $370 billion under the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, for communities to pull on, but they have to know about it at that level, at the community level. They have to, in fact, Jigar Shah on this very show, who's running the Energy Department loan program, he kind of said what we need is 19,000 John Drawses. He wasn't talking about John Draws, doing this counterproductive work, but he was saying, here I am in the government. I can't tell you to get our money to decarbonize your buses, but so we need. So what have you learned about him that might be applicable in the flip side?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think one of the biggest takeaways is something that a lot of people were mentioning in the comments and when they would quote retweet this story when it went viral, which is that all politics are local. So we tend to think about climate action as the COP conferences in Egypt recently, or we think about a statement from Biden, or we think about the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think that it's easy to miss the fact that so many decisions that are going to impact emissions happen at the state level, they happen at county level, they happen at the city level. They even happen at your local school board, like whether you're going to put solar panels in your school or take some of this money from the EPA to transition your fleet of buses to electric buses, not diesel buses. That's a school board decision. And so I think that that's a really important insight. I think it's easy to see one city as not consequential, but I think the distributed nature of this, to your point, and the scale that is possible with the internet is key. So if you can get 10,000 people across the country to show up to their school board meeting and then show up to their city council, show up their county commission meeting and advocate for, first at the simplest level, just taking the money that is going to be distributed from the IRA and putting it to use, deploying these climate solutions, but then advocating for policy changes and better regulations to reduce fossil fuel use and deploy climate solutions. I think that's key. And I think that if thousands of people across the country were doing that in their community, we'd see huge impact. So that's one of them. I think another one that is more niche to John Draws, if you will, is that local journalists really want sources that have been localized. And so John Draws, with that North Carolina study, was looking at one specific policy that the state was debating and had a 112-page presentation based on that. That's going to receive a better audience than a report from NOAA that talks about sea level rise generally. Exactly. And so I think if climate advocates can adapt some of the research that's out there and say, hey, in our community, here's how much we can save by switching to wind energy or putting solar panels on our roof. Here's how much we could improve our air pollution. A lot of that data is out there. Groups like Energy Information Agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, they have great reports that are localized and will go down to a city level or county level. And so you can put together that research or kind of consolidate that and present that to lawmakers in your community. And that's going to resonate more than some distant agency in Washington. And so I think that's another lesson probably.
And repetition. I think Draws showed up more than once. I mean, it's having that data. And you're right. You talked about the numbers of people showing up, of having the expertise there as well is critically important to counter these other sorts of things.
Totally. Yeah.
One other issue, though, of course, and this is something that all of us in journalism who are focused on solutions as well as problems face, is unfortunately they have the far easier task. You know, he's trying to maintain the status quo, and the idea that you don't have to have diesel buses. Even an opportunity like that is a big change. It's like, well, we have buses, they take our kids to school. And one of the things I'm fixated on through the coming year is this question, what can you do to overcome these sources of energy friction that are going to impede these sort of broader goals in climate action? So your skills and the way you've done your journalism, I think, is really interesting. I want to talk about your methodology, not just your findings. The way you use Twitter, amid the storms that Elon Musk has generated on Twitter by throwing a giant boulder into public discourse, and now actually blocking journalists who dare to write about the latest thing with his private jet tracking. it's astounding to think how bad the climate is on Twitter at a certain level, but it's still incredibly useful. So could you talk about your own methodology? Twitter threads are a high art. How did you even learn to do that? And what could other journalists who want to sort of build a presence, whether it's on Twitter or you can't do threads on Mastodon like this. I'm not quite sure where else this can happen, but what have you learned about through that process of doing the journalism that way? That was different than what you were doing at Carbon Switch and earlier.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, Twitter has been a huge tool for me. I've been able to reach millions of people with these stories on Twitter. And I actually started using Twitter for promoting some of my work about a year and a half ago while I was building Carbon Switch. And originally I was trying to get some of my research out there, get people to care about heat pumps and induction stoves and the stuff that's honestly fairly boring. We're talking about HVAC or in the case of like a hot water heater, plumbing. And so I was trying to kind of think of how to get that story out there because your furnace and your water heater are responsible for 20% of emissions in the country in general, or home energy use in total. And those are the two biggest causes. So I started just writing about some of what I was finding, producing some of this research, sharing it on Twitter. Unsurprisingly, didn't get a huge audience writing about HVAC and plumbing on Twitter, but started to learn that if I wrote something that was really concise and if I just summarized it, people would share it and it would start to reach more people. So as the Inflation Reduction Act was going through Congress at the time called Build Back Better, there was kind of this trend of people that were going into the bill text whenever it was released and going and like kind of summarizing what was in it, what wasn't. And so I started to do some of this with electrification and some of the heat pump policies and heat pump hot water heaters. And this is kind of an example of like crowdsourced journalism where all these people were doing it and then journalists could read that and write one article with everything. Because we're talking about bill text that's like 1,200 pages or something. So I did that, kind of grew some followers, reached some people, and then just started writing about some of the guides for Carbon Switch. And I think maybe got to like 10,000 followers or something that way, had some posts that did fairly well. This summer, I decided to step away from Carbon Switch and was kind of in transition limbo for about 3 months and was feeling antsy by the end of this 3-month break, wanting to publish something, but not really knowing where I would publish it. Like, was I going to write for other outlets? Was I going to start something new? And so finally, I just sat down one day and was like, I'm just going to write one thread about something I've learned about climate change every week. And so I started this a couple months ago. And the first one, which was a thread looking at all of the coal plants that have been saved by crypto mining companies, this one kind of took off and was shared a couple thousand times. The next week, I published one about these NIMBY groups that were funded by think tanks like Caesar Rodney Institute, who have received money from fossil fuel companies. That one also took off. And then I kept on publishing these stories. And I think the third or fourth one was this thread about John Draws, which I'll be honest, I wrote it one afternoon. And on these, I will be honest, like I will spend a day writing a thread. So it's not like I'm just like quickly writing up my thoughts. Like I'm treating it like it's a article story. And I use a tool called Chirp. There's tons of these tools out there that will let you edit the story and look at it as it's going to be a thread. So I'm not like posting the first tweet and then posting the next one, which you'll see a lot of journalists do, which to me is just incredibly stressful because like once I hit that first publish, like I've got to keep on going. So I'm able to do it at my own leisure. So I did this one day with the John Draws story and then had to rush and get home to feed my son and give him a bath. And I just like hit publish and left. And I was biking home thinking, oh, that's not a great story. I don't know. No one's going to care about this one guy. And then I log on later that night, a couple hours after, and it's just blowing up. Like my notifications are bugging out, getting like 20 notifications a second or something, people sharing it, seeing like all these names that I recognize, people who I've respected and followed for years tweeting about it. And so I think that one reached like 11 million people or something. It went
astounding,
pretty viral. But yeah, I think I've just learned that if you can write really clearly and just distill things down to the core essence of it, like not get too lost in something which I have a habit of like the words and like trying to make it sound poetic. Twitter just isn't going to be that. Like it's about like, give me the point, almost like bullets, and kind of like setting up questions like, this person's doing this. Why are they doing this? Here's why they're doing it. It's kind of boring in that way, but that's been fairly successful for me.
So Chirp, this is why I like doing this show, and I know Dale feels the same way, because it's a constant learning curve on these new social media. Threads have been around for a while, and I've always been wondering. I've been in more of the flailing mode when I've tried unartfully to do threads. And how did you find Chirp originally? Was it the kind of thing where you saw someone else had used it, or?
Yeah, I think that I had seen someone that posted something using it. If you want, I can show you a thread that I'm working on right now and kind of how I use it if I can present.
Yeah, you can. There should be a share. You should have the share screen option. And then what happens is it'll pop up in a way that we can share.
Okay.
Yep, cool. There it is.
So we'll go in here. So you can see it okay?
Yeah, there it is.
Great. So this is what the tool looks like. We're getting into the weeds here, I guess. But I found this valuable, so can kind of share it. So this is a thread I'm working on right now about this series of documents released by the House, an investigation into greenwashing by big oil companies. So the House put out their PDF, right? It's full of great information, but at the end of the day, it's a PDF that says memorandum, and no one's going to read this. And so what I've tried to do is distill this into a series of tweets with some of the takeaways. So I can load up the first tweet here, and then I can actually see how it's going to look in Twitter, and then write the whole thing. This kind of breaks up each of the tweets. I can also load up images here to see how those will look in the tweet. I think images are something I try to use a lot because I know that picture is worth 1,000 words. So if I've only got 280 characters, that image is going to communicate a lot. And a lot of times people want to see something. Like this is a tip from the Vox journalist Johnny Harris, who's one of my favorite filmmakers, who is talking about how he produces videos. And I think Vox has this style with their videos where it's all about like, here's this thing, look at the thing. Now let me give you context on that thing. And I've tried to do that here. So look at this ad from Chevron, or the series of ads. Now I'm going to give you some context on that ad. Look at this ad from BP. Now let me give some context. And then I guess just the last thing I'd say on this, and on Twitter in general, another principle that I've kind of taken from another platform is that that first tweet is the most important thing. It's the hook. I think this is a similar tactic from YouTube, which YouTubers like Mr. Beast, who's got the biggest following in the world right now, he said that the most important thing in a video is the title and the thumbnail. And a lot of filmmakers kind of get that backward. They make a video, spend many weeks on it, and then they go to write the title or thumbnail. I've kind of taken that same principle here, which is like, I think of this first tweet as the title and thumbnail. This is the thing I have to hook your attention with. And so I'll rewrite this like 5 times and really try to think like, what's that thing that's going to grab someone's attention and quote, stop the scroll, like get them to kind of click into it and care. And so this is a good way to do it because I can see like, how is it going to look as I'm scrolling through something. And then I use this like thread emoji to try to indicate to people, like, if you click this, you can you can see more about it. So that's kind of some of the behind the scenes, I guess.
Yeah, although it should be, in front of the scenes in a way. Here's the Cheer app, which I'm going to actually dive into now because you hooked me.
I knew this was going to be big for you, Andy.
Well, yeah, and we could talk for a few minutes here about Twitter itself. Have you had your own personal struggle with the question of staying there, or I'll just tell you my priors right now. I'm staying because I find it endlessly useful. Elon Musk's activity at the top is very unethical, and but how many of our telecom companies and all these tools we have been owned or misappropriated by bad people at the top? Doesn't mean they're not useful, and I keep trying to kind of spread that gospel. So are you looking at the other platforms, or are you thinking this is still uniquely valuable, and if so, why?
But Verizon and those guys are not spreading a lot of disinformation and controlling the message in that way. But I'm sorry, go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I have had my struggle over the last couple weeks of whether to stay and keep producing on the platform or go on to another platform. I'll tell you, if there was a great alternative, I would have switched weeks ago. There isn't, in my opinion, a great alternative for Twitter. I think the thing that Twitter provides that is so unique is that all of the kind of journalists and all of the publishers and editors are on the platform and have famously used it for years to kind of set the news agenda and decide what stories they work on and find sources. And I think that what's been interesting with my experience with Twitter is I've been publishing on the internet for like 10 years, and most of it's just been total obscurity. Like nobody has read any of my stuff. I've produced like dozens of videos. Nobody's really watched my videos. And then I've started to reach an audience over the last couple of months. And, folks like yourself have reached out and invited me onto this webinar, or some of my favorite podcasters have invited me onto their podcast. And so if I was publishing that on TikTok, the odds are pretty good that these people aren't going to find my stuff, even if it reaches 1 million people. It's like exactly. The quality of the power users, I think is one of the key things at Twitter. But I think the thing I worry about with Twitter is that the culture of the platform will change, and that the technology itself, like the algorithm, will start to change, and they'll both work on one another, kind of have these feedback loops where I'll suddenly stop seeing all this incredible information from climate activists and scientists and academics and all these people who I've been learning from over the years. If my feed becomes white supremacists and Elon bros that are celebrating Tesla and SpaceX, then I don't want to be on that platform. I don't want that, in some cases, just terrible, toxic stuff. And in other cases, just kind of annoying culture that I think that's going to be the thing that will be what I watch is how does the culture of the platform change? Because I've been on a lot of these platforms, and ultimately that's the thing that matters to me. Like YouTube, I think, has a great culture. I think that even though they have some problems, even though their executive team isn't perfect, they've really sent a signal to creators that they care about the people creating on the platform and that they're doing their best to improve the platform. But lately, Elon Musk has been kind of sending the opposite message and pushing away power users.
Yeah, for sure. Have you seen the one thing that's so different, as you mentioned with TikTok too, YouTube is still sort of unidirectional. It's not a conversation space, except in the comments can be pretty nutty. But
totally.
As you said, you found people here. You find I've done a bunch of posts on my Substack blog, whatever you want to call it, about ways to. I think the big thing with Twitter is using it with intention. If you sit back and rely on your feed, then you're kind of doomed. But if you go in there with intention, either to learn or to connect, I was impressed. For example, I had it open earlier. I saw you kind of link out or you reference others, like you you in one of your Twitter threads there, you were pointing to a woman who had done a induction stove kind of artwork. I think that's something that's all too rare these days. Most media are link inward; they don't reach outward, and Twitter is a place where you can really create that interlaced kind of relationship with the question, which is kind of cool.
Totally, yeah, and I think that's something that the climate community has that's really unique, is this culture of trying to lift people up. And I've taken a lot of inspiration from Dr. Leah Stokes at Berkeley, who I just see on Twitter. She's like such a positive energy. Like, she's just always commenting on people's stuff saying, this is so great, congrats, or great work on this new report. Or she's retweeting people's work and kind of lifting them up. And I think Bill McKibben is another person who does this a lot and tries to lift other activists up and spread some of their work. So I've been trying to just kind of learn from them and do my best to share people's work who I think should be reached by, or should be reaching more people.
Dale, anything else you want to?
Well, we just have a couple minutes left, so I want to transition over to.
Your audio is still really bad.
Something about the connection here. Is this any better?
Yes. Don't move.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. Can't move away from my computer. So your thoughts on how local journalists can take what we've been talking about, the whole disinformation role, and bring it into their community. How can they localize? Often when journalists hear these big issues, they struggle with finding a way to really report it on in their home. And of course, the obvious is look at your planning boards, look at all those things and see what sort of issues are coming up in this realm and see who's commenting on it. But do you have any other thoughts of ways journalists can find entry points to covering this idea?
Yeah, I think that the local government meetings is a key one. I think that joining Facebook groups is a good place, or like looking at what's going on in some of these influential social media platforms. I think that can kind of give you a indication of what's to come at some of those meetings. So if you'd been trying to cover like Montgomery, Indiana, I think was a county that last week banned all solar and wind projects in their community. And you might not have shown up as a local journalist to this county commission meeting because you might have thought, oh, it's just another meeting. There's not going to be anything interesting. But if you've been following what's happening on that Facebook group, you would have known that basically an angry mob was coming to that county meeting because they were all organizing. They were all fired up, worried about wind turbines catching fire and solar farms contaminating their water supply. And I think having that story ready, understanding the context around it, being able to fact check it so that the next day the story wasn't, or maybe in the days before, it wasn't just about what had already happened, but was providing people with the context and the facts that they need. I think that's really important because instead what's happening is that these people get really riled up on Facebook. They show up at the county meeting and then the county commission votes and the bill's been passed by that point. So if you're writing a follow-up to it, you kind of miss the opportunity for impact and where the facts can really change the public's mind and lawmakers' mind.
One of the ways that this
is a form of solutions journalism, really. In other words, getting ahead of the problem.
Yeah, I think so. And I think just trying to provide the fact-checking to the public and to the lawmakers before that debate starts to happen and when the vote happens, that can get people from both sides to show up to the county meeting. So it's not just people who are really worried about some of these misleading claims, but it's people who are saying, hey, I'm really worried about pollution in my community, or I'm really worried about climate change, and I think we need to act. And then you get passionate advocates fighting for solar and wind, not just
or there's a loan available and it pays itself back in 6 months.
Absolutely.
But some of the government bodies, in a sense, don't want that kind of input. I had a local online newspaper here in my community 15 years ago before people were doing that. And what our school board would do is all the major decisions were made in the committee meetings prior to the school board meeting. So the school board meeting was just a yes vote. come in, okay, so we've talked about this, yes, we talked about this, take a vote, and it's very quick. And all the action was happening in the committee meetings. So if you only went to the school boards, you missed all the decisions that were actually being made. Another aspect, and something that journalists can do that I've never seen that we did in our paper, was we simply put up a map every week that would go to the planning. We'd go to the planning board. Here are the agenda items, and we'd put a pin on the map for every item that was happening there. Because typically people would say, well, my neighbor just knocked down half their house and they're doubling its size, and I didn't know this was happening. But they could look at the map and see that proposal was on the agenda meeting that night because there's a pin in their community showing what that agenda item was. So one way of informing the public is simply showing them what's happening in your community and what's being discussed. So that can also increase public participation, which is generally a pretty good thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think just making people more aware of the decisions that are being made and the implications is a key thing. Obviously, the role of journalism.
Yeah, I'm interested in Draws and what he did there, and we've got to wrap up in a second here. But how much of his work happened at that committee level meeting, with meetings with legislators in their offices, with those sort of more direct personal contact approaches where a lot of this stuff actually happens?
Yeah, I think that's really common. There's evidence in the public record from FOIA requests that watchdog groups have done on Draws and on some of these other think tanks that show that he was emailing back and forth with legislators. He was getting private meetings, which it sounds nefarious. In a lot of cases, it can be, right? When fossil fuel companies kind of pay to play in that way. But the reality is that any citizen can request a meeting. And at the local level, the odds that you get someone to take a meeting with you are really high. Like, a lot of these people don't get that many requests, or when they do, it's just someone screaming at them. So if you sit down, have a coffee, learn about them, understand them, empathize with the position they're in, and then share your concerns or what you're really passionate about, and share some of the facts, that can be really influential. I think in our polarized age right now, it's easy to kind of dismiss persuasion as something that's impossible. But I've been reading a lot about persuasion lately, and a key takeaway from me is that, like, on most issues, people are 60-40 on something. They're not 90-10. And so you can move them from being 60%, like, I don't know about these wind farms, to moving them across the line and getting them to support the stuff and eventually become champions on this. So I think at the local level, that's really important, both with our neighbors, but then also with lawmakers, trying to reach them and ultimately to persuade them of being climate champions.
Old school politics, conversations amongst each other.
Yeah, not yelling on Twitter at each other.
Yeah. Andy, any last thoughts before we wrap up?
Just that the more we can do on this Sustain webcast and on my writing at Substack on that very opportunity, the better. I think finding ways to engage at the local level is really the vital need right now. And it's a toolkit question too, whether it's what are the tools needed to be aware, especially where the need is greatest, that there's billions of dollars available for resilience projects, for clean energy transitions. The role of journalism in doing that, as Dale was saying, there's plenty to do with how we shape our content. Dale, I love that idea of the map you guys used to have. If you have a map of opportunity and problems, and as opposed to just writing stories, then that can create trust in journalism. That's sort of in short supply these days, and more engagement on the, cutting through the disinformation that's always going to be there. The biggest challenge to me still is the inertia factor. If you're a John Draws, you're just trying to maintain the status quo. It's really easy to do that. If you're Leah Stokes or Jigar Shah or Michael Thomas, the task is tougher. I'm just really glad that this came together today. Dale, thanks for hosting it. This is the Columbia Climate School Sustain What webcast. This will be archived for those who couldn't watch it full time. They can watch it anytime on all those different platforms. I'll try really hard to write up some of the takeaways on my Substack blog, and I guess this is, to me, this is like chapter 1. Not to mention your insights on Chirp and how to write a cohesive and coherent and engaging thread is a really important task right now, and that transcends Twitter. That's whether it's video or whatever your content is. Finding that the old journalistic concept of the hook. You know, it was hard enough in a newspaper to hook someone's interest, but when you have everyone in scroll mode and like manufactured distraction mode, not just manufactured
and 280 characters,
yeah, then you really have a challenge. So thanks so much for being here, and maybe you can come back sometime too.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's been fun to talk to you both, and appreciative of all the work that you're doing.
Happy holidays, everybody.
All right.
Take care.
Thanks.